We've started.
Okay, thank you. Good afternoon, everyone. I can't see anybody, so it's a little strange since I'm simply looking at my PowerPoint, but I hope you can see it. The topic today is constructionalization and constructional changes revisited. As I mentioned last time, Graham Trousdale and I wrote a book on constructionalization and constructional changes. It came out in 2013. There's been a lot of discussion since then that has motivated us to rethink. It's always important to rethink one's approach. So before I get started, I want to summarize main points last time that are going to be important and give you a roadmap for today. Okay, the summaries from last time. Just two main points. According to Goldberg's cognitive construction grammar model of language, linguistic knowledge is knowledge of form-meaning pairings, and it is a usage-based theory. This is fundamental to Graham Trousdale and my view of constructional change. And I take the following positions about change. This again is a summary from last time. Change involves conventionalization in the community of language users. I will elaborate on that today. Morphosyntactic change is gradual. Analogy is a crucially important change type. However, all change involves neo-analysis, but not all change, of course, involves analogy. All of those points will be revisited today. This is an outline of how my talk is going to develop. I'm going to talk a little bit about early historical work from a constructional perspective, what are predecessors of our current thinking. Say a few things about relevant contexts, which will become more important not only today, but in the coming days. A question that has been raised by Martin Hilpert about our practices as we develop our thinking. Then I will remind you or tell you of what Graham Trousdale and I said in our book on constructionalization and constructional changes. I'm going to abbreviate that book as T&T and introduce some critiques of it, and then present a revised characterization, and then talk about how constructionalization comes into being. That's what precedes it, the pre-constructionalization. What happens after it has occurred, that's post-constructionalization. And then we'll have revised characterizations of constructionalization and constructional changes. Let me start with a personal point, and I think this is not only myself, but pretty much everybody. When we first started thinking about historical ways of working with construction grammar, all of us were primarily thinking about in terms of grammaticalization. So we had a background, a common ground, if you like, of grammaticalization. And the main project in grammaticalization had been testing the hypothesis of unidirectionality. After 30 years of working with grammaticalization and testing unidirectionality, I found it was frustrating to be writing in terms of mainly meaning or mainly form. That's how we did our visits. People would say that I interpreted grammaticalization as semantic change. No, I didn't, but the way we operated was that we were talking about one or the other. And we also talked about the trajectory of one expression, like be going to or what you will. And construction grammar offered a path to explore both form and meaning together. and to embed particular trajectories within a larger metaphorical constructional space, which I will explain later. And so much of my thinking about constructionalization is informed by the 30 years of practicing grammaticalization. I think it's important for you to understand that, or for anybody who is reading the constructionalization book or thinking about our new interpretations of it. We are very much based in our thinking in work on grammaticalization. In these introductory remarks, I'd like to remind you that there are two meanings of grammaticalization and constructionalization. Just as there are two meanings of syntax or phonology or morphology or any topic in linguistics. One meaning has to do with the changes that we think we see in the data, with the processes. And of course, historically, we can only infer those processes. So that's, what actually happens in change. The other has to do with the framework in terms of which we interpret the data. And today I'm going to be mainly talking about the framework, using a bit of data to illustrate TNITs. In later lectures, I will talk mainly about kinds of change and processes of change. Now, just to put a perspective on the time depth of work on historical construction grammar, it's now called diachronic construction grammar. Oh, I think I skipped a. Okay. The first historical constructionalist publication was Israel in 1996. That was not very long ago, tracing the development of the way construction that Goldberg had talked about, like pushing our way through the underbrush, through the forest, worming our way across the branch, giggling her way, or his way, through the dinner. That was the way construction. And then the next major historical work that followed was Noel 2007, which advocates limiting historical construction work to the development of grammatical markers. Now, he has gone beyond that. He has rejected his own recommendation in 2007. But I just mentioned that as a historical footnote to an explosion of work that happened in 2008, at least the publications. The work had happened before. But in 2008, 3 volumes came out, which were very influential in historical work on construction grammar. One was Berks and Diewald, Constructions and Language Change, a collection of papers from a conference. Another was Hilpert, Germanic Future Constructions, which is very interestingly on the borderline between grammaticalization and constructionalization, and I will be talking about it later. And Eckhart et al., Variation, Selection, and Development, in which diachronic construction grammar plays a significant role, but it's not exclusively on historical construction grammar. And then came, I'm just picking out some major works in my thinking, De Smet, 2013, Spreading Patterns, Hilpert, 2013, Constructional Change in English, Traugott and Trousdale, Constructionalization and Constructional Changes, which is what I'm going to be talking about mainly, Petre, Construction in Environments, 2014, and Barthdahl et al., 2015, Diachronic Construction Grammar. That is a collection of papers. And since then, there's been a great deal of functionalist historical morphosyntax that's been done from a constructionalist perspective. What was a very new field in 2008 is coming to be well established and interrogated in interesting ways, for example, by Hilpert, and I will mention that momentarily. Now, my question that is really the basis of today's talk is, what does a constructional perspective on change focus on? It focuses on the development of conventionalized patterns in morphosyntax. Here, analogical thinking and analogization are important. It focuses on assemblies of linguistic contexts. Collocations are important here, and I will be talking about those. And changes in, as I mentioned before, metaphorical notion of constructional space. That concerns the strength of alternatives that are available for any particular kind of construction. So, for example, if you're thinking about quantifiers, what are the options that you have, talking about large size, small size, and so forth. We, Traugott and Trousdale, proposed a distinction between constructionalization and constructional changes. We still think that that's a good idea, but we recognize that some aspects of the distinction have been challenged, and rightly so. And I'm going to present reasons for maintaining the distinction and provide revised characterizations. But first, I need to say a couple of things about context and an overall constraint on research practice, just to ground the new characterizations. Bybee, Perkins, and Pagliuca, perhaps quite famously in 1994, said, everything that happens to the meaning of a gram, which is a grammatical morpheme, happens because of the context in which it is used. The context in which they said this was work on grammaticalization, typological work on the development of grams. But I think that we can elaborate on that now and say everything that happens to the meaning of a construction or anything that happens to meaning at all happens because of the context in which it is used. Don't need to limit that to the development of grammatical morphemes. What kind of contexts are we talking about? Well, there are, of course, really important social contexts, but unfortunately, they very often cannot be gleaned from corpora. What can be gleaned from corpora are primarily linguistic, specifically texts surrounding an expression, what has been called cotext. What historical constructionalists and others look for is replicated context in the syntagmatic linear flow of speech and writing, that's collocations. What goes with what? Does be going to go with any kind of verb or only a limited set of verbs? We look for replicated context in paradigmatic alternatives, which is what are our choices? If we want to talk about the future, we can use be going to, we can use will, we can use shall in some circumstances, we can use be to, and a variety of other constructions there. What are the constraints on our choices there? So syntagmatic, paradigmatic dimensions, as Jakobson said in the 1950s, are crucial to any kind of thinking about language in general and certainly about how things change. And we also think about systemic changes such as word order, vowel shifts, and how these relate to particular syntagmatic and paradigmatic changes. Systemic changes are things like word order changes or consonant pattern changes or vowel changes in English. The Great Vowel Shift was a big systemic change that affected all kinds of things. That's the change, for example, the modern word child was child, and of course we still have that in children, but children is a complex morphosyntactic word, whereas child is a simple one, and the Great Vowel Shift occurred in these simple monosyllabic and stressed syllables. So moving on to the question about practice, still as background. One of Hilpert's challenges to historical constructionist work concerns how to think about the problem of the cognitive commitment of construction grammar. I mean, he's a practicing diachronic constructionalist. So he's challenging himself as well as everybody else. What is it that we can or should try to reconstruct? Goldberg talks about, and Langacker talk about accounting for speaker knowledge. So can we justifiably think of ourselves as reconstructing minds rather than structures? That's his question. His answer is that, quite frankly, if we're doing diachronic construction grammar associated with Goldberg and cognitive construction grammar, we need to recognize that the goal cannot actually be to investigate linguistic knowledge and mental representations of speakers and addressees of the past, since we cannot access these. Rather, diachronic construction grammar should offer a framework for descriptions of language change in which discussion of form and meaning, context, schematicity, and productivity have a natural central place. And I agree with that. I think this is what we are actually doing when we're doing diachronic construction grammar. We are offering a framework for descriptions of language change of a particular kind, because we have a focus on form and meaning and context and schematicity. Now, there's a very provocative title you may have come across, Schmidt and Muntlich. This is only a picture of Schmidt because I couldn't find one of Muntlich. The title is Entrenchment in Historical Corpora, Reconstructing Dead Authors' Minds from Their Usage Profile. It's a very interesting paper because it sort of challenges us to think about the Hilpert type of question. It was written before Hilpert 2018. But it's very inconclusive in the end. But there's a lot to learn from it. This is what they say. The usage patterns and profiles of individual authors can provide an indication of how their uses of a given construction were represented in the minds in terms of entrenched patterns of association. Now, that's a fairly cautious statement. Can provide an indication. Fair enough. There's a lot less caution elsewhere, however. The paper is a quantitative corpus analysis of the construction noun be that. So the truth is that from the mid-17th to the late 19th century, and their purpose is to show that the range of nouns has been greatly reduced in this construction since the 17th century. So we used to have nouns meaning will, sense, wonder, and report before the 17th century. So Chaucer, writing at the end of the 15th century, refers to the will of Christ was that. And Schmidt and Montlick say those uses have either obsolesced in this construction or come to be preferred with two rather than that. Well, I looked this up in my database, which is Koha, different from their database, and this corpus of historical American English. And it shows that there are 114 hits of the wonder is that, and none of the wonder is two in the relevant sense. The 35 in COCA, the corpus of contemporary American English, and no uses of wonder is two either. And this suggests that wonder is that is obsolescent, but hasn't ceased to be used yet. So the lesson there is that different corpora will give us different results. Now, Schmidt and Montlick's main point is that the author's use of this noun be that construction is very varied in terms of both the frequency with which the construction is used and the type of noun that is selected. There are, however, less strong individual collective differences. So what they're trying to do is to demonstrate that what individuals use is not an exact mirror of the type of conventionalized shared information. That is no doubt absolutely true. But I find it hard to associate these findings with minds rather than the data resources. They present Schmidt's entrenchment and conventionalization model. And according to this usage model, what we generally assume to be language or the linguistic system comes about and is continuously updated by the interaction of two very important things. Entrenchment, which is strength of replicated individual knowledge as reflected by use that one can track in a corpus. If we have a corpus with sufficient information about individuals, that is a big if, because many of the corpora do not give extensive material from the same author. To track strength of replicated individual knowledge, you of course need to have plentiful data from one author, and they do. They have from Pepys's diaries, and they have from novels by Dickens and Thackeray and George Eliot and other novelists. So we have an interaction of what individual knowledge is and conventionalization, which is collective knowledge as reflected by replicated use of a construction by several authors. So we find several authors using one particular construction or another. And this comes about as a result of social processes in the community. The takeaway conclusion from their article is, beneath the surface of idealized speakers, hearers, individual variation is rampant. That, I think, is true. But I really doubt that we can project from that our idealized speaker hearers are actually reconstructing the minds of those idealized speaker hearers. A footnote to that is that, in fact, Graham Trousdale and I have disagreed over the years about that. He is much more interested in trying to reconstruct individual minds than I am. I feel that I'm not a psychologist, and I have no access anyway to the mind of someone 200 years ago or 1,000 years ago, or even further ago. So that's generally background. I've touched on ideas about relevant context, a caution about assumptions we bring to our work. And now I'm moving on to construction section. This term was first used in Rostia 2004 was taken up in Noel 2007. And Noel uses it to refer to the development through which certain structural patterns acquire their own meanings so that they add meaning to the lexical elements occurring in them. For example, the way construction. Note that that way of talking about what happens is not usage-based. He did, however, in 2019, produce an article that he calls a radical approach to usage, where he says that that kind of way of talking about things is definitely not acceptable in the usage-based approach, because structural patterns don't acquire their own meanings. People, users, language users give meanings to structural patterns. But that was 2007, we're now in 2021, so a lot has happened since then. There have been various approaches. Smirnova, 2015, thinks of constructionalization as a process of gradual accumulation of contextual restrictions prior to structural reorganization, neo-analysis, of materials such as form meaning change. And we think of it as pre-constructional change, as I will explain. Now, our old definition, 2013 definition, is as follows. Since form and meaning are combined in a construction, we thought of constructionalization as the creation of form new, meaning new combinations of signs. It forms new type nodes which have new syntax or morphology and new coded meanings in the linguistic population of speakers. It is accompanied by changes in degree of schematicity, productivity, and compositionality. And before I go on to introduce some of the critiques of that particular characterization, I would like to spend a few minutes deconstructing the really very abstract language there. What does type node mean? What does schematicity, productivity, compositionality mean? So, nodes. Nodes in construction grammar are constructions with links to other constructions. The idea is that constructions are stored in memory, and that's no doubt true at earlier times and present times. And as the brain consists in part of a network of neurons with nodes, we can hypothesize that constructions are stored in nodes. Token nodes are initial innovated storage points, and type nodes, which are referred to in that definition, are conventionalized storage points, strengthened by repetition and shared by several individuals in a community, as Schmidt and Mundlich discuss. Schematicity. Schemas are abstractions across sets of constructions which are unconsciously perceived by language users to be closely related to each other in the neural network. By hypothesis, there's a constructional space of, for example, quantifiers. We have this set of things, a lot of X, a heap of X, a shred of X. In English, this space has come to be very richly populated. This set is closely related to older quantifiers, much, many, few. Together, they make a kind of constructional space, and Hilpert 2013 talks a lot about constructional space. And both sets are very distinct from networks of other constructions, for example, constructions referring to truth, belief, or mechanisms of linguistic change. Now, how does one measure distance? Hilpert measures it in terms of collocations. So we can talk about a bunch of grapes, a bunch of nonsense, but we're not going to be talking about a bunch of reanalyses of quantifiers, at least as frequently, or about, there's not a shred of inflectional morphology. Those are going to be very, very infrequent collocations. So we can measure this notion of constructional space, what's in it, and what it is distant from in terms of collocations. Then there's productivity, the degree to which a schema is extensible. Barthdal wrote a book about this, and it has to do with the extent to which a schema sanctions subschemas, and a schema is constrained. Now I could use the quantifiers and say that the quantifier schema sanctions a couple of subschemas, one of which has the form in indefinite article noun of like a lot of X or a shred of X. The other of which is largely monosyllabic. And productivity determines not only the extent to which a schema is extensible and has type nodes, but also is constrained. Where will you use one form or one construction or the other? The example I have here is clefts. Clefts of various kinds have become quite productive. The construction, it was Peter who did X, Y, or Z, has been used since about the year 1000. So it's a very old, 1,000-year-old construction. Then there are a bunch of other clefts called pseudoclefts. And those arose in around 1600. The thing I did was, what I did was, all I did was has a lot of pragmatic force, which is the only thing that I did, and is often quite rejecting of blame. So this new productivity can be related to systemic loss of verb second in English, which is common in many of the languages, of the Germanic languages. Then came the king. Then came the king. Verb is second there. And there was a reconfiguration of the topic focus structuring when V2 was lost. And all are constrained initially by anaphoric reference to a preceding proposition. Not surprising, because they all start with pronouns: it, what, all. But it clefs can now be used cataphorically. It was Ellen Prince, I think, who first said that, but Amanda Patton wrote a whole book about the development of it clefs. And an example is, it was Cicero who once said, which is sort of construction that you can use at the beginning of a lecture with nothing preceding. So that one has changed its constraints. So the point there is that when we're concerned with productivity, we're not only concerned with the number of subschemas and the number of options that are available, but we're also concerned with how the schema is constrained. Now, another one of our abstract terms in the definition is compositionality. And that has to do with the extent to which the link between meaning and form is transparent. Both of the examples in 2 are compositional on the literal reading and non-compositional on the idiomatic reading. So, an example from Kay and Michaelis. My yoga instructor sometimes pulls my leg. Well, the yoga instructor is pulling somebody's leg in order, for example, to prevent some kind of seizure that a person has, or to strengthen the leg. That's literal pulling of a leg. But it's also an idiomatic thing. My yoga instructor sometimes pulls my leg, and the idiomatic meaning is sometimes jokes with me, teases me. Kay and Fillmore's example, famous example, what's that fly doing in my soup? Well, it's not a question about doing, though it could be, but mainly what it is a construction with a very idiosyncratic meaning, which is, I don't like what's that fly in my soup. It's idiosyncratic. And Boyars and et al., in one of their critiques, rightly says that compositionality in the original definition should have been better distinguished from analyzability, the extent to which speakers can recognize the contribution that each component makes to the whole. For example, walked and opened the door are compositional and analyzable. So walked is walk plus past tense. Open the door is open plus the and door. Compositional and non-analyzable is went and was. Those are compositional because we understand the meaning is past tense of go and past tense of be, but morphologically, they're not analyzable or not easy to analyze. Non-compositional and analyzable is undergo, be subjected to, or to experience. We might think of that as being under and go, but they don't really have anything anymore to do with those two meanings. But they are analyzable in terms of morphology. Now, the development of non-analyzability is an important topic in work on grammaticalization. I think in work on constructionalization, compositionality, which has to do with meaning, is more important. Now, since changes, we thought, do not always result in a new form meaning pairing, such as be going to future, becoming begonna. We thought of it as a phonological change and proposed a distinction between constructionalization and constructional changes, in which we said a constructional change is a change affecting one internal dimension of a construction. It does not involve the creation of a new node. And that has been highly criticized, and we think rightly now, looking back. So many people, including ourselves, have not been satisfied with the distinction between constructionalization and constructional changes as we formulated them in the 2013 book. Among many people who have raised questions are Boyars et al. 2015, Hilpert 2018, and Flach 2020. The concern has been the distinction between constructionalization as the coming into being of a form new, meaning new pairing, and constructional changes as changes that affect one component of a construction. It's the one component of a construction that is the problem. The argument is that changes affecting only one component of a construction are rare. Most form changes have some discourse functional aspect. In fact, when I was a graduate student back in the 1960s, there was a statement much repeated different form, different meaning. The rise of Ghana is associated with casual speech. And if casual speech is regarded as a discourse function, then the emergence of Ghana should count as a new pairing of form and meaning. So distinction doesn't really seem to hold up very well. Now here are Boyers on the left, Vincent in the middle, and Walton on the right. They are concerned that our characterization of change assumes that we can draw a precise starting point for constructionalization. That, I think, is a misunderstanding. Since we assume continuous, tiny steps, conventionalization in the community, and only partial access to data, we do not envision a precise starting point. But they are right in pointing out that not enough is said about how links change. So usually when you have a critique, there's some good points and then there's some misunderstandings, and that just wanted to point that one out. Flach argues that there are two readings of constructionalization in the creation of form, new meaning, new combinations of signs, accompanied by changes in degree of schematicity, productivity, and compositionality. And this is a very interesting point, I think. She says a process reading accompanied by changes in degree of schematicity, productivity, and compositionality. And there's a process reading there accompanied by changes. But there is a point result reading associated with the creation of form, new meaning, new signs and notes. So basically, our criticism is that the old definition gives us a mixture of some point at which a new construction comes into being and process. She says that our characterization of constructionalization refers simultaneously to constructional changes surrounding the new node and the new node itself. And she's concerned that what she calls con-constructionalization, constructional changes, muddies the distinction that we were trying to make. And it muddies a distinction that ceases between process and point change. She proposes that constructionalization be reserved for the point reading, which entails that constructionalization is instantaneous, and that constructional changes be reserved for the process reading, which may be gradual. But I think there's a problem here. I think her point is well taken. The definition did do too much and does deal, I absolutely agree, with her point, which is there's a muddied distinction between the development of a construction and the processes that somehow surround it. But I don't think her solution works. Problem is, as Schmidt points out, for individuals to play a role in change, replicated use leading to entrenchment is needed. And that's gradual. It's not an instantaneous process. And Flach does not leave room for change in conventionalization, which is also gradual. She seems to be of the mindset that change is innovation. And although we recognize that the distinction between constructionalization and constructional changes can be hard to maintain, when doing fine-grained quantitative work, we do find that when we look at corpora, they attest to the rise of new conventionalized form-meaning pairings. Any corpus that you look at, looking for some particular kind of construction, whether it's be going to or by the way, or one that I will talk about later, which is the variation between give Mary something and give something to Mary, you will suddenly find the emergence of a new way of doing things. And that's what we want to capture. So we think the distinction is worth maintaining. But in doing that, we want to do more than we did before in distinguishing between changes prior to and post-constructionalization. These changes prior to and post-constructionalization are somewhat different, and we didn't recognize that in the 2013 book. And we also think that questions about how many speakers make a community or how many steps are required to lead to constructionalization, such as Flach raises, are too dependent on the contents of corpora to be useful. That's why I talked about the Schmidt and Mantlik paper. A lot depends on the corpus that you use. So we propose to characterize constructionalization in a very pared down way. Constructionalization is the establishment of a new symbolic association of form and meaning, which has been replicated across a network of language users. This new characterization is meant to highlight result, establishment of a new symbolic association of form and meaning, and conventionalization, which has been replicated across a network of language users. Establishment is not the same as Flach's point because the outcome is interpreted as the result, however temporary, of changes involving gradual spread across members of a community, what Schmidt calls conventionalization. Now note what was not in that new characterization. There's no mention of type nodes. So there's no mention of something that appears to have some kind of psychological reality. There's no mention of coded meanings. That was too narrow because it doesn't cover primarily pragmatic constructions, such as discourse markers, which have very little, if any, coded meaning, but do have very conventionalized pragmatic meaning. I'm thinking of things like after all, by the way, all the same, but, and so forth. And it does not mention degrees of schematicity, productivity, and compositionality. Those three are now treated as post-constructionalizations. So, as I said, this characterization is very minimal, but we think that it does account for what we're looking for, which is the emergence in corpora of new form meaning pairings. So now I'm going to turn to pre-constructionalization. What processes lead to constructionalization? And here we need to think about individuals and communities. Individuals are relevant for innovation and entrenchment, and communal groups are relevant for conventionalization. That's actually just picking up there on the Schmidt-Mantlik paper. Constructionalizations are the result of shared generalizations over constructs. The constructs are what people say, what people hear, The idea is that individuals generalize over similar replicated constructs. I said this last time. They generalize over them, and a generalization in the individual can be an innovation, but when it is replicated by others in the community, then it will be conventionalized. Constructionalization of most expressions and schemas is the gradual outcome of multiple small changes. These pre-constructional changes are tendencies, they're not determinative. It's not every time some particular kind of chunking happens that you will get a new construction, but they often involve chunking and some loss of compositionality within a construction, resulting in diminution of the degree to which the meaning of a construct is accessible. So be going to be, motion with a purpose, is less compositional, in my view, in the passive than in the active. A thief was going to be hanged. It's a very old example, of 1477 example, is less fully specified than the soldiers were going to hang the thief, because the purposing agent is not overtly expressed. Now, second point, the first one was chunking. Second point is that adjustments that involve replication of semantic content or syntactic context are pre-constructionalization only relatively loosely connected with the emerging new construction. These include changes in routinized assemblies of constructions and belong to what Boots and Petre call a cotext that is generally quite large, or to the fixing of strings. Boots is on the left and Petre is on the right. So their claim is, and looking at the data with their claim in mind, I can see that this holds up in most cases. The kinds of semantic content and the syntactic context are relatively loosely connected with the emerging new construction. You can see that in the data. The third point about pre-constructionalization is there tends to be increased frequency of assemblies of cotextual shifts. So these syntactic contexts that Boots and Petre draw attention to come to be used increasingly frequently. An example of an assembly that Petre in 2019 gives and Boots and Petre in 2020 for the development of the Be Going to Future is as follows. They have two main contexts: use in relative clauses and questions. The imminent action is more important than motion. Lady Mary of Burgundy, whom he was going to marry when death prevented him. Now that's a 1586 example. And from the more general context, we can see that he was going to go somewhere from one place to another. That's motion. You know, he was going somewhere to marry Lady Mary of Burgundy. That is in a relative clause. Whom he was going to marry. And positioning it in or using it in a relative clause makes the imminence of the action more important than the motion. This is a pragmatic interpretation and what I have called an invited inference from the context. Another context is use in passives where the agent is not in control. You see that my magazine is going to be taken from me. So dramatic rises in frequency of use of these contexts, topicalization in the 1620s, passive in the 1640s, lead Butts and Petre to hypothesize that there was a qualitative leap associated with the conventionalization of a pattern, or indeed the emergence of a new construction. Everybody agrees that we go into a future developed somewhere around the beginning of the 17th century. And what they have done is show the kinds of contexts in which that happened. I assume by qualitative leap, they mean a distinct internal structural shift. What I was talking about when you look at your corpus and you see suddenly new uses that weren't there before. Now, once you get these new uses that weren't there before, you will find additional new uses. Those are usually very narrow, sneaky modulations. Sneaky is de Smet's term. Very tiny little shifts in collocations, most of which do not lead to a new form meaning pairing. So post-constructionalization, in a process of propagation across linguistic contexts known as actualization, the modifications are, on the whole, more local than those prior to constructionalization. Say Butts and Petre, and I think they're right. Again, post-constructional changes are tendencies. They don't have to happen. They are not deterministic. Often, there is collocational expansion spread to new immediate environments. Schilpert 2008 was discussed at length. Loosening of restrictions on the verb and on the subject in the case of be going to future. So, for example, loosening of constraints, restrictions on the verb are exemplified by new verbs, not marry and visit, actions that you can go somewhere to do. They come to be stated verbs like, going to like, going to be, and there changes in the subjects. I'll illustrate that in a moment. In the case of connectors, we find changes in the scope over the following clause. An example, she fell by the way, where by the way means along the road. On the way now, we don't use by the way with that locational meaning. But as she was traveling, she fell. As she was walking, she fell. Well, the new construction, which is a discourse marker, by the way, she fell, which is a comment by the speaker, occurs at the beginning, has a different prosody and increased scope. So these are examples. Post-constructionalization, you get collocational expansion. It's very often, it's basically syntactic expansion. What are the possibilities of what goes with what and what its scope is? Secondly, you get increase or decrease in frequency of use. Change in the token productivity of the new construction. Token productivity here is the number of instances, the number of times you can use the new construction. Third, some loss of compositionality, the meaning of the parts become less clear. But sometimes there is what's called folk etymology. Non-compositionality may be reversed. A nice example is ang nail, painful nail. Ang there is the ang of anxiety. It's pain. That's what it used to be. Anxiety causing nail. And people lost any sense of what ang meant, and they produced hangnail. Now, similarly, you get bridegroom, which used to be breed guma. Now, guma there is man, person. It's phonologically related in Indo-European to human. So it meant bride man, but the guma ceased to be used in the meaning of man. And people did a folk etymology and tried to give it some compositionality. Didn't make too much sense, but they came up with bridegroom, where you can actually think of two semantic parts. So we got some loss of compositionality. The meanings of parts become less clear over time, and some loss of analyzability within a construction. The parts become less distinct and accessible, a change which, as I said, is typically associated with grammaticalization and reductions like be going to be to be gonna be. Fifth, we get generalization over microconstructions and alignment to other microconstructions, which may lead to incorporation into a more abstract schematic type node. So be going to be was incorporated into the future construction. Originally, it was used as a relative tense marker. That means it was used to indicate time before and time after, but it's used for time after some reference point. And 100 years after that development, we find that it is being used as a deictic future. So this leads to expansion of the schema, which in the 16th century consisted of will verb, shall verb, and in the 17th century of will, shall, and be going to verb, future. So this is an increase in type productivity. We also get continued use of pre-constructionalization contexts, especially alignment to the schema, may lead to a better fit to a schema. So be going to future was at first relative, as I said. So it was a marginal member of the future construction. Will and shall, which already were futures, were used as both relative and deictic futures. So the new be going to was not a very good future. And over time, it came to be used with a better fit. And that occurred in the 18th century, particularly in the context of raising syntax. So you get examples like, I'm afraid there's going to be such a calm among us that. I'm afraid there is going to be. There's no agentive subject there. You've got this so-called dummy there. This is what Langacker called off-stage subjectivity. I, speaker, predict deictically that there's going to be such a calm among us that something's going to happen. So a revised definition of constructional changes is based on the idea that pre-constructionalizations and post-constructionalizations are constructional changes. The characterization is modulations of contextual uses prior to and following constructionalization. Notice again, we don't have long lists of terms like productivity and schematicity. Both these definitions are very minimal. Now, you may wonder how in the world, on a constructional form meaning basis, can we model the development of being going to? Is this all just pie in the sky ideas? Well, here's an attempt, which I see has a typo in it. Here's an attempt to show how the constructions changed. And if you read off it carefully enough, when you know how to read these things, you will see the difference between constructionalization and constructional change. Now, what I've done here is I've taken Croft's model of a construction, which I discussed last time, which is a construction, which is a unit in this outside box, and has two subparts, which can change. It has three meaning subparts: syntax, morphology, and phonology, linked with a symbolic link to three kinds of meaning: semantics, pragmatics, and discourse function. So motion be going to V. I am going to visit my aunt. Consists syntactically, and I'm reading in the left-hand box here, of an intransitive verb, go, in its own clause, and a to verb of any sort, which is another clause, which is motion with a purpose. The to be is another clause because it's a purposive clause. Morphologically, it's be going brackets to be. This is a morphologically separate from be going to. And phonologically, it's something like be going to. Semantically, it's motion with a purpose. Pragmatically, it's future oriented because its purpose is always future. And discourse functionally, it's an agent controlled event. Now, I've not really known how exactly to represent context, but I've made an attempt here. This is the context. One could list a lot of contexts. I only picked out the two I talked about, that Butz and Petre mentioned, the use in relative clause and the use in passives. Give rise to, around 1620, give rise to something that is quite different. Now V2, look at the brackets here, quite different from there. V2 auxiliary, followed by a verb, and I've just signaled that it's not available in raising constructions, just to emphasize that this verb is a rather special kind of verb, but I don't have space to list all the kinds of verbs. Morphologically, it's be going to as a unit, as a chunk, plus verb, same phonology. Semantically, it's the relative future, which means that pragmatically it signals sequence of events, and it's a tense. And then post-constructionalization, there are various other contexts, which I mentioned. I've just picked out a couple here. Post-class expansion, so more and more verbs are being used here. As I mentioned, stative verbs start to be used. Be going to like something. We're going to like that. Well, you can't go somewhere in motion in order to like something in most worlds we know. And it began to be used in raising constructions. When it was used by enough people, in raising constructions and have become conventionalized, we get something new. We get going to plus verb, no restriction on it. This NR is gone. Be going to verb, morphologically. The semantics is future, and it's a deictic future, and it predicts. And here we have further context, using rapid speech, which from 1900 on gave us begunner. But it also is future deictis and prediction. Now, how do we read off of this constructional changes and constructionalization? If you look in here, you will see a lot happened. We have a syntactic change from a main verb in a clause to an auxiliary. We have a morphological change that we're going to get chunked. We have a new meaning, new pragmatics, and new tense. That is constructionalization. That's a whole bunch of new things emerging. Then we had further use in various kinds of contexts. And we don't get much. The major thing that we get is this deictic future and prediction. So the changes that are happening over here. They happen just in the meaning component, not in the form component, which stays basically the same. The only difference is that this verb following be going to no longer is restricted. And this is where the typo happened. There should be a verb after this, be to aux be, exactly like this one. And the change that went on here is a change in phonology, but nothing changed over here in the meaning. So if you think about it this way, with a very much expanded notion of construction of the sort that Krafft introduced us to, and features, you can readily see that this is a fundamentally different sort of change, a constructionalization change, quite different from these kinds of changes. Here, the only major change had to do with meaning, and here the only major change had to do with phonology. Once you start thinking that way and modeling changes that way, the distinction really becomes very clear, in my view, at least. So to summarize, our revised characterizations are that constructionalization is the establishment of a new symbolic association of form and meaning, which has been replicated across a network of language uses. And constructional changes are modulations of contextual uses prior to and following constructionalization. Now, I've talked a lot about the history of be going to verb. It was treated as a prototype example of grammaticalization. And in the next lecture, I will outline the goals of grammaticalization and compare grammaticalization and constructionalization approaches. They really do complement each other in the area of changes that result in tense, modality, case, and other kinds of markers. They are quite different in other respects because the range of work in constructionalization is far larger. It includes what I will talk about later, which is the development of things like variation between I gave Mary a book and I gave a book to Mary, the ditransitive and prepositional form of the dative construction. So thank you for your attention, and let's have a 5-minute break, and I look forward to questions and comments. Thank you. Okay. I could type an answer, but I think it might be better to try and think this through. If there's a correlation between constructionization and grammaticalization, then the first can also be thought of as a process in addition to the final project. Well, yes, but as I pointed out, the processes are primarily pre-constructionalization and post-constructionalization. The process, of course, of the two coming of the new of developing a new construction is a process. I don't think that there's anything in the definition that we use that would preclude that. I'll pick that up next time, because next time we are going to talk about grammaticalization and constructionalization. But my constructionalization is the establishment of a new symbolic association of form and meaning, which has been replicated across a network of language users. Well, establishment is a process, and replication is a process. So yes, I agree. They are processes. But in fact, they're very different kinds of processes, because when we think about grammaticalization, we're going to talk about mechanisms like neo-analysis, as I call it, or reanalysis, analogy, and so forth. And when we do constructionization, of course, we're going to think about neo-analysis and analogy. We do think about process. The point that I was making at the beginning was that today I was not going to focus too much on the process. What I was focusing on was the framework, the mindset that leads us to think about constructionalization. So yes, I agree. Okay. Now, I don't really have time to cover all of that, but the answer is yes. In language, everything is construction. I mentioned last time that one of Hoffman's provocative questions about construction grammar was, is it really true that language is construction all the way down? Which was a nice soundbite that Goldberg has used many times. And I said, I don't think that is in fact true. Not everything is a construction. For example, position of discourse markers, the by the way that I mentioned. By the way can occur pre-clausally, by the way she fell. It can occur post-clausally, she fell, by the way, you're adding on something. It can even occur in the middle. I think she fell is too brief, but one could conceivably have she, by the way, fell. There are three positions there in which most discourse markers occur. After all, occurs in those three positions. All the same occurs in all those positions. Now, and and but don't, but most discourse structuring markers do. So I would say that those positions are simply positions in which discourse markers can be used. It would take a whole hour to explain all of that. But I'm picking up on the first statement, everything is a construction. Yes, that's what Goldberg said. If we test that idea, perhaps not everything is a construction, and I invite you to think about that. So how do we interpret polysemic and hybrid contexts? Would they be constructions too? Well, polysemy has been accounted for in terms of allostructions, as Capel calls them, like allophones, allo constructions. And when I get to talk about the ditransitive, I will mention some of these issues. How do we deal with polysemy? Well, we can say that alternatives of various sorts, and yes, they are. I think your question is, are they constructions or less than constructions? Yes, they are constructions. They are full form meaning pairings. They happen to have a special link, which Van de Velde called a horizontal link. Hybrid, well, as Van de Velde has pointed, and lots of people have pointed out, there are often hybrid constructions with, that is, constructions with several sources. And yes, those are constructions too. Is a construction space a bigger schema? Yes, I think it's a very abstract notion that linguists have when they want to account for paradigmatic options. That's what it really is. And yes, it is a very abstract kind of schema. Yes. As a follow-up, can constructions be realized by different forms? Yes, absolutely. And let's see, which lecture is it? I think it's number 5. I'm going to, as I said, talk about the ditransitive prepositional and also benefactive variations, where this issue of different forms is crucial. Goldberg has had a different approach to these variations from most other people, but I think generally it is agreed that the so-called ditransitive and dative are variants of each other. The example I've been using is give Mary something and give something to Mary. Now for the benefactive, you have build Mary a building, and build a building for Mary. They have slightly different forms, but they are pairs. They're prepositional and non-prepositional, ditransitive and preposition alternations. So yes, they can have different forms. The forms need to be fairly similar. Now that's a kind of subjective notion. And those of you who have read Goldberg 1995 will remember that she thinks that the generalizations over such constructs as give Mary something are very close to resultatives like load the truck with hay. So I have a problem with that because with hay is a preposition. So I'll come back to that later. Okay, the transitive phrasal verbs in which a particle may adopt 2 positions. I suppose you're thinking of look something up and look up something. And yes, absolutely. I mean, that's the kind of thing that Capella called allostructions. And this is a paper that he wrote or published in 2006 and has been very influential in the way people think about variation, because part of what we know, and now I'm talking about what we know as present day speakers, is surely that these things are in some sense variants of each other. So part of our knowledge of language is that some things can be realized by different forms. It's a little harder historically to see how this happened, but you can surmise when you see the development of things like from a rise and then you get rise up. First of all, you get a kind of agglutinative construction replaced by an analytic one, rise up. That happened all over the place in the history of English because English became, for the most part, more analytic. Do you consider the paradigmatization in terms of DeVal 2020 can be interpreted as post-constructionalization? Yes, definitely. She has been developing ideas about paradigmatization, first of all, in the context of grammaticalization. And she says that it's a fourth stage, or did say in, I believe, 2012, that it's a fourth stage of grammaticalization. In other words, it occurs late. It's part of what I was talking about with becoming a good member of a set. So paradigmatization, in her view, is a lot more constrained. 2020, I'm not sure that I'm familiar with, but anyway, what I've read of hers has a rather structural view of paradigmatization, which is that there is a pairing of a marked, unmarked kind, and one particular variant is used more frequently than the other, or has a different kind of structure from the other. And this can only occur when people start aligning new constructions into an already existing schema, in my view. So yes, I do consider it as a post-constructionalization. And to be going to is an example of that. Concerning transparency and analyzability, it does seem a perceptual concept. How can we determine it? Analyzability is, yes, I think it is a perceptual concept. It's also a rather linguistic concept, in my view, probably why we didn't discuss it very much in our book. There's examples from Boyers and company. Walk, walked, I don't think anybody would disagree that that is very analyzable and it's compositional. When we get to went, I suppose most people who are speakers of English would say, yes, went is a very odd past tense of go. But do they really have a knowledge of that is structurally important? I don't know. So yes, I agree with you. It is a perceptual concept. But it's also very clear from those folk etymology examples that I gave that it's not just linguists who think about it. Some people will find that something, a bisyllabic word or trisyllabic word or multisyllabic word is worthy of reanalyzing or neo-analyzing and giving it a structure that it didn't have before. That means that this perception must be a reality, at least for some people who initiate it and who then adopt the so-called folk etymology. Well, the tests. I don't think we used a test in the Traugott Trousdale book. And as I said, it was probably a mistake to think of Ghana as an example of a single change. How are we going to prove or demonstrate that Ghana has no new meaning? Well, as I said, it depends on how you think about things. You may recall that in that last uh, model that I gave, I did not include such things as rapid speech, so-called external contexts. But the minute you do include them, then be going to have, as a rapid speech phenomenon, is going to signal something. It's going to signal it was rapid speech, that it was informal. Don't usually write it. So if somebody writes it, that signals that they are probably not highly educated. It signals all sorts of things. So what are the criteria and tests? The criteria have to do with how one delimits context. I was here today talking about co-text, which admittedly is a rather abstract notion. It's the text that we find in our corpora. But in life, which is where we use language, we don't use it in corpora. In life, when we use language, there's always a situation, or Halliday called a situational context. There's always interaction, there's negotiation of meaning between at least two people. There's cultural context, there's all kinds of contexts. There's a context of what sort of interaction do we have? Are we talking like right now in an academic situation? Are we talking at the dinner table? So the tests have to do with what the linguist decides to use as criteria for identifying contexts. So that's how I would go about demonstrating whether something like gonna has no new meaning. As I said today, I now have come to the conclusion that it does have a new meaning, but it has a social meaning. It has a meaning related to rapid speech, and is not something that I would consider to be a co-text in the very narrow sense that I was talking about it today. Is a token node a construct? Yes. Dick Hudson, who writes about word grammar, thinks of nodes as exclusively token nodes. I personally, and Graham Trousdale as well, find that is not terribly useful for doing historical work, because in historical work you want to see not only what some particular token was, what the innovation was, what the individual did on an individual occasion, but we also want to think about replication and conventionalization. So yes, token node is a construct. All right, I feel there's a new indexical meaning in Ghana. How do we determine what counts as a new meaning? I think I covered that before. I agree there's an indexical meaning, but the indexical is not really to the text so much as to the context and to the social context and to the register. Now, you might not agree with that, but that's the way I parse it. I think it indexes, yes, as I said, it indexes informal, it indexes rapid speech, but I do not consider that a co-text. Oh, distributional semantics. I may get to talk about that a little bit in my last talk, which is about subjectification, which isn't strictly speaking construction grammar related any more than it is strictly speaking grammaticalization related. But every time there's a change, there's a question, is this more subjective or less subjective, or more intersubjective or less intersubjective than it was before? Now, clearly, begun to deictic future is more subjective than relative future is. So distributional semantics, yes. Distribution is very much related, I think, to my notion of invited inferencing, which is that there are meanings that are distributed over the whole chunk or clause. It is compatible, but I haven't worked out the details of that one. Oh, yes. That deletion of I believe. Well, first of all, we don't know for sure that historically there is the case of that deletion. I know that Thompson and Mulak proposed that in 1991, and somehow that notion seems to have stuck. And of course, it's an attractive one for modern speakers because modern speakers do have two variants there. I think that, and I think without that. However, Laura Brinton has written several articles and books arguing that in some cases, the so-called matrix clause, I guess that, I think that, I mean that, are not actually the source. Now, I think in the case of, I may not be recalling correctly, but I think it's in the case of, I mean, she says, yes, that probably was a matrix clause that was the source of that one. But it's very unlikely that it was the source of I think, or I believe. Those she finds in her data mainly appear in adjunct clauses, as I think, as I believe. So here I'm countering the first sentence, context of comment clauses. That deletion account for conventionalization. Well, in theory it could, but in actual fact, when you look at the data, it probably doesn't. Conventionalization can occur with that deletion. I think there's no question about that in the case of complementations. I believe you are right. I believe that you are right. That is not a comment clause. That is a matrix clause. There's no question that historically there has been that deletion. And it would account for entrenchment, but to the extent that is simply the deletion of that in a matrix clause, meaning I believe that you are right, I believe that this is a good question, and it's variant without it, that. In that change, that's a constructional change, because all you've done is you've got rid of it. That. To the extent that some comment clause might have been a matrix clause, and as I say, I'm not remembering correctly, but I think Brinton said, I mean, probably was. Well, let's just go with that as a tentative example. In the case that I mean, started out as a main clause. I mean that. Loss of the, or non-use rather, of that did enable it to be used as a discourse marker or comment or marker. And yes, that would be an enablement of the constructionalization. And does it enable the entrenchment? I don't know. I mean, the only thing that enables entrenchment is people using things. That's what entrenchment is, that there is replicated use, innovation in the individual, according to Schmidt, entrenchment of replication across a community of speakers. Well, I don't think that that deletion is going to necessarily lead to entrenchment in that sense, because there's no reason why a community of speakers should choose to use that deletion. So it doesn't enable the entrenchment, but it does enable the rise of, potentially enable the rise of a comment clause. Yes. No more questions. Okay. Well, those were good questions. I appreciate it. And if you have questions that you think about and that come to mind in the next few days, please add them to the forum, and I will be delighted to answer. I have found your questions very, very valuable. I appreciate it. Thank you.